This is the history of the Jewish nation under the rule of the last ruling kings of the Seleucid kingdom. It covers a period in history from about 174 to 160 BC. The best reference that will be used is the first and second books of the Maccabees of the Roman Catholic canon, which tell the history of Antiochus IV and all he did leading up to the revolt of the Maccabees, the Jewish people. Information will also be used from the book, Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus. The two books of Maccabees are not found in the Hebrew Bible. Neither is the books found in the Protestants' King James Version because they were considered by Protestants to be part of the pseudepigrapha books. However, the books were put in the Catholic version as part of their apocrypha. What the Seleucid kingdom carried the Jews through was horrific. However, the Lord never leaves his people, for he is always there when they need deliverance. As we conclude Daniel's vision, we get a good idea of what will happen before the Lord return the second time. In the last days, it will be persecution of Christians, similar to the persecution of the Jews when they would not follow the blasphemous policies of the rulers. They were horrifically persecuted until death. So likewise, just before the second coming of Jesus, true Bible-believing Christians will not follow the rulers' blasphemous policies, and they would rather die before they profane the sacred things of the true God to worship a false God. Today, it is happening now, the beginning of blasphemous laws and policies of our government, to try to make us follow them. Such as the Gay Marriage Act and the pro-abortion, that if we are not okay with it, trouble will soon follow. Now, I will continue the prophecy given to Daniel given in Daniel 11 verses 29 through 39, and try to explain it. Number 1. At the appointed time he will return and go toward the south, but it will not be like the former or the latter. 4 ships from Cyprus will come against him, therefore he will be grieved, and return in rage against the holy covenant, and do damage. So he will return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And he will muster forces, and they will defile the sanctuary fortress, then they will take away the daily sacrifices, and place there the abomination of desolation. The prophecy is explained as follows. A period of religious persecution came upon Israel after Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, became king of the Seleucid kingdom in 175 BC. He made an expedition in 168 BC to Egypt, and captured and plundered the fortified cities in the land. At the appointed time, Antiochus IV desired to bring all Egypt under his rule, therefore he returned and made a second expedition toward the south, but it was not like the former or the latter. He went to places in Memphis and took them. He went to seize Alexandria, but the Romans drove him away and forced him out of all Egypt. Roman ships from Cyprus came against him, therefore, he was grieved because his plan to conquer all Egypt failed. And because of the Romans to whom he feared, he turned in rage against Israel, the Holy Covenant, to do damage. After Antiochus IV had defeated Egypt, he returned and went up to Israel and to Jerusalem with a strong force. He boldly invaded the sanctuary and took away the golden altar, the lampstand for the lights with all its fixtures, the offering table, the cups and the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the golden ornament on the front of the temple. He stripped off everything and took away the gold and silver and the precious vessels. He also took all the hidden treasures he could find. Taking all this, he went back to his own country, after he had spoken with great arrogance and shed much blood. There was great mourning for Israel, in every place where they dwelt, and the rulers and the elders groaned. 2 years later, Antiochus IV, the king, sent the Mysian commander to the cities of Judah, and he came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He spoke to them deceitfully in peaceful terms, and won their trust. Then he attacked the city suddenly, in a great onslaught, and destroyed many of the people in Israel. He plundered the city and set fire to it, demolished its houses and its surrounding walls, took captive the women and children, and seized the cattle. Then they built up the city of David with a high massive wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. There they set up a sinful race, perverse men, who fortified themselves inside it, storing up weapons and provisions, and depositing there the plunder they had collected from Jerusalem. And they became a great threat. The citadel became an ambush against the sanctuary, and a wicked adversary to Israel at all times. They shed innocent blood around the sanctuary, and they defiled the sanctuary. Because of them the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled away, Israel became a stranger to her own offspring, and her children forsook her. Her sanctuary was as desolate as a wilderness, her feasts turned into mourning, her Sabbaths to shame, and her honor to contempt. Her dishonor was as great as her glory had been, and her exaltation turned into mourning. Antiochus IV, the king, wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, each abandoning his particular customs. All the Gentiles conformed to the command of the king, and many Israelites were in favor of his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. The king sent messengers with letters to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, ordering them to follow customs foreign to their land, to prohibit burnt offerings, sacrifices, and libations in the sanctuary. They were to profane the Sabbaths and feast days, to desecrate the sanctuary and the sacred ministers. They were to build pagan altars and temples and shrines, to sacrifice swine, which are pigs, and other unclean animals. They were to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to let themselves be defiled with every kind of impurity and abomination so that they might forget the law, and change all their observances. Whoever, those who refused to act according to the command of the king was put to death. Such were the orders the king published throughout his kingdom. He ordered the cities of Judah to offer sacrifices, each city in turn. Many of the people, those who abandoned the law, Israelites who were in favor of his religion, joined them and committed evil in the land. The Israelites who held to the law was driven into hiding, wherever places of refuge could be found. Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to force the Jews to abandon the customs of their ancestors and live no longer by the laws of God. Antiochus IV profaned the temple in Jerusalem and dedicated it to the Olympian Zeus, and on Mount Gerizim to Zeus the Hospitable, as the inhabitants of the place requested. This intensified the evil in an intolerable and utterly disgusting way. The Gentiles filled the temple with debauchery and revelry, they amused themselves with prostitutes and had intercourse with women even in the sacred court. They also brought into the temple things that were forbidden, so that the altar was covered with abominable offerings prohibited by the laws. A man could not keep the Sabbath or celebrate the traditional feasts, nor even admit that he was a Jew. Moreover, at the monthly celebration of the king's birthday, the Jews had from bitter necessity to partake of the sacrifices, and when the festival of Dionysus was celebrated, they were compelled to march in his procession, wearing wreaths of ivy. Number 2. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he will corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God will be strong and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand will instruct many, yet for many days, they will fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they will be aided with a little help, but many will join with them by intrigue. And some of those of understanding will fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. The prophecy is explained as follows. In those days, a family of Jewish patriots and rulers prominent in the 2nd and 1st centuries were known as the Hasmonaeans, particularly Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the family of Jorib, left Jerusalem and settled in Modin. He had 5 sons, John called Guddi, Simon called Thassi, Judas called Maccabeus, Eleazar called Avaran, and Jonathan, who was called Ephus. When he saw the sacrileges that were being committed in Judah and in Jerusalem, he said, "Woe is me! Why was I born to see the ruin of my people and the ruin of the holy city, and to sit idle while it is given into the hands of enemies, and the sanctuary into the hands of strangers? Israel's temple has become like a man disgraced, her glorious ornaments have been carried off as spoils, and her infants have been murdered in her streets, her young men by the sword of the enemy. What nation has not taken its share of her realm, and laid its hand on her possessions? All her adornment had been taken away. From being free, she has become a slave. We see our sanctuary and our beauty, and our glory laid waste, and the Gentiles have defiled them. Why are we still alive? Then Mattathias and his sons tore their garments, put on sackcloth, and mourned bitterly. The officers of King Antiochus IV, in charge of enforcing the apostasy, came to the city of Modin to organize the sacrifices. Many of Israel joined them, but Mattathias and his sons gathered in a group apart. Then the officers of the king addressed Mattathias, "You are a leader, an honorable and great man in the city, supported by sons and kinsmen. Come now, be the first to obey the king's command, as all the Gentiles and the men of Judah and those who are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the king's friends, and will be enriched with silver and gold and many gifts." However, Mattathias answered in a loud voice, "Although all the Gentiles in the king's realm obey him, so that each forsakes the religion of his fathers and consents to the king's orders, yet I and my sons and my kinsmen will keep to the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the commandments. We will not obey the words of the king nor depart from our religion in the slightest degree." As he finished saying these words, a certain Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modin, according to the king's order. When Mattathias saw him, he was filled with zeal, his heart was moved, and his just fury was aroused. He sprang forward and killed him upon the altar. At the same time, he also killed the messenger of the king who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus, he showed his zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did with Zimri. Then Mattathias went through the city shouting, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and who stands by the covenant follow after me." Thereupon he fled to the mountains with his sons, leaving behind in the city all their possessions. Many who sought to live according to righteousness and religious custom went out into the desert to settle there, them and their sons, their wives, and their cattle, because misfortunes pressed so hard on them. The officers and soldiers attacked them once, but they did not retaliate. They neither threw stones, nor blocked up their own hiding places. They said, "Let us all die without reproach, heaven and earth are our witnesses that you destroy us unjustly." So the officers and soldiers attacked them on the Sabbath, and they died with their wives, their children, and their cattle, to the number of 1,000 persons. When Mattathias and his friends heard of it, they mourned deeply for them. "If we all do as our kinsmen have done," they said to one another, "and do not fight against the Gentiles for our lives and our traditions, they will soon destroy us from the earth." On that day, they came to this decision, "Let us fight against anyone who attacks us on the Sabbath, so that we may not all die as our kinsmen died in the hiding places." This day, the Maccabean revolt began. Then they were joined by a group of Hasidians, Hasidim Hebrew, valiant Israelites, all of them devout followers of the law. And all those who were fleeing from the disaster joined them and supported them. They gathered an army and struck down sinners in their anger and lawbreakers in their wrath, and the survivors fled to the Gentiles for safety. Mattathias and his friends went about and tore down the pagan altars. They also enforced circumcision for any uncircumcised boys whom they found in the territory of Israel. They put to flight the arrogant, and the work prospered in their hands. They saved the law from the hands of the Gentiles and of the kings and did not let the sinner triumph. The Hasmoneans or the Maccabees were members of the Hasmonaean family of Jewish leaders and rulers. The Hasmonaean family was made up of the sons of Mattathias and their descendants, which reigned in Judea from 367 to 37 BC. Under the name of the Maccabees, the Syrians began to take note. Before Mattathias died, he chose his son Judas Maccabeus to be the leader of their army, and direct the war against the nations, for Judas was a warrior from his youth. They were commanded to gather about them all who observe the law, and they were to avenge the wrongs of their people. They were to pay back the Gentiles what they deserve, and observe the precepts of the law. Mattathias blessed his sons, and he was united with his fathers. He died in the year 166 BC, he was buried in the tombs of his fathers in Modin, and all Israel mourned him greatly. It was from that time forward, the sons of Mattathias were constantly in guerrilla warfare with the Seleucid kings. After the death of Judas, the transgressors of the law raised their heads in every part of Israel, and all kinds of evildoers appeared. Blasphemy and persecution never completely ceased until the Seleucid kings of Syria were defeated by the Roman commander Pompey, who made Syria a Roman province in 63 BC. It was between 65 to 62 BC, Pompey conquered the Mithridates, and the Tigranes the Great, king of Armenia in 140 to 55 BC, and Antiochus XIII king of Syria in 69 to 64 BC, annexing the territory of the latter to the Roman dominions. Pompey also subdued the Jews and captured Jerusalem. On his return to Italy, he disbanded his army, and in 61 BC, entered Rome in triumph for the third time. When Maccabeus and his companions under the Lord's leadership had recovered the temple and the city, they destroyed the altars erected by the Gentiles in the marketplace and the sacred enclosures. After purifying the temple, they made a new altar. Then, with fire struck from flint, they offered sacrifice for the first time in 2 years, burned incense and lighted lamps. They also set out the showbread. When they had done this, they prostrated themselves and begged the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortunes, and that if they should sin at any time, he might chastise them with moderation and not hand them over to blasphemous and barbarous Gentiles. On the anniversary of the day on which the temple had been profaned by the Gentiles, that is, the 25th day of the same month Kislev, the purification of the temple took place. The Jews celebrated joyfully for 8 days as on the Feast of Booths, remembering how a little while before, they had spent the Feast of Booths living like wild animals in caves on the mountains. Carrying rods entwined with leaves, green branches, and palms, they sang hymns of grateful praise to him who had brought about the purification of his own place. By public edict and decree, they prescribed that the whole Jewish nation should celebrate these days every year. Today, this celebration of the Jews is called Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. It is celebrated today around the same time Christians celebrate Christmas. Judas Maccabeus successfully recaptured Jerusalem, reconsecrated the temple, and restored Jewish worship in 164 BC. After he was killed in battle by the army of Demetrius I Soter, in the year 161 BC, the transgressors of the law in every part of Israel, all kinds of evildoers appeared. The Jews led by Mattathias' sons successfully fought the Syrians, also destroying the perverted men of Israel, who fell away from the covenant and joined the Greek Hellenizing policy of Antiochus IV. Judas' brothers continued the struggle against the Seleucid kings until 142 BC, and under Simon, the Jews regained their independence. The Mattathias Jewish family had established themselves as rulers of Judea from 168 to 142 BC. John Hyrcanus, 134 to 104 BC, the youngest son and successor of Simon his father, was the last ruler to rule, for he never proclaimed himself king, but designated himself high priest and leader of the Jewish nation. He freed Judea from all Syrian influence, and Judea remained practically independent under his rule. The Jewish nation attained its greatest prosperity under his reign until 63 BC. The Hasmoneans or the Maccabees, were a Jewish family who revolted against the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, who set up an abomination of desolation in the temple of Yahweh. This started a civil revolt, which led the Jewish people in their struggle for freedom and independence from the Seleucid kingdom of Syria. The Jewish forces of the Maccabees defeated the Syrians, and the Syrians were forced to abandon Judea, and the descendants of Judah and Simon Maccabeus ruled. They gained their independence after many bitter military struggles. The Maccabees were Jewish patriots and rulers prominent in the 2nd and 1st century BC. Judas Maccabeus was the most renowned member of the Hasmonean family, followed by his brothers Jonathan and Simon. The Maccabees became a dynasty of rulers and kings that established an independent Jewish state, relatively free of Hellenism in Judea. They began to rule themselves through the Hasmonaean Dynasty. The Hasmonaean Dynasty lasted from 175 BC, and ended with Aristobulus III, in 36 BC. However, he did not rule the Jewish people, he was only a high priest. John Hyrcanus, 134 to 104 BC, was the youngest son of Simon. He freed Judea from all Seleucid Syrian influence, conquered, and later colonized the provinces of Idumea and Samaria, parts of Galilee and territories east of the Jordan River, converting large parts of the populations to Judaism. He designated himself high priest and leader of the Jewish nation, for he never proclaimed himself a king. He, however, departed from the purer principles of the earlier Hasmoneans, provoking the popular group later known as the Pharisees, and causing religious strife that came to dominate the history of the Judean era. Nevertheless, the Jewish nation accomplished its greatest prosperity in his reign. Aristobulus I, from 104 to 103 BC, succeeded his father, John Hyrcanus. They called him Judah. He was the oldest son of John Hyrcanus. He was the first ruler to declare himself king of the Hasmonaean Dynasty. He claims the title king and high priest, whereas the kingship title was only to come from the Davidic lineages, and Aristobulus I was a descendant from the Levites. Therefore, the Pharisees were infuriated with the claim of kingship and began a massive rebellion to depose him, but Aristobulus died before this could occur. Alexander Jannaeus, 103 to 76 BC. Alexander Jannaeus succeeded his brother Aristobulus I, and became king and high priest. He followed the policies of John Hyrcanus in conquering and Judaizing surrounding territories, eventually extending the boundaries of the Hasmonean kingdom further. However, Alexander Jannaeus was not a good king. He was more of a dictator, ruthless, and his reign was marked by intrigues and internal strife. During a siege of a Greek city, he was killed in action. Salome Alexandra, 76 to 67 BC. Salome Alexandra was a queen of Judea, and the wife of Alexander Jannaeus. She supported the Pharisees and made their leaders her principal advisors on the internal policy. Just before the outbreak of civil war between her two sons Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, she died. John Hyrcanus II, 67 to 63 BC and 40 to 37 BC. John Hyrcanus II was king and high priest of Judea at two particular times. The first time, he was a king until his temporal power was taken away, but the second time after being restored, he was demoted to the governor of the province. He was the son of Salome Alexandra and Alexander Jannaeus. His priesthood was appointed by his mother Salome. However, his younger brother, Aristobulus II, seized the government, and forced Hyrcanus to agree to an arrangement whereby the temporal power and the religious power would be divided between the two of them. The arrangement was that Aristobulus II would hold the temporal power, and Hyrcanus would hold the religious power. However, when Antipater, an Idumean in 43 BC, who was a citizen of Jerusalem at that time, sought to further his own ambitions, offered to help Hyrcanus to regain the temporal power. Antipater raised a revolt in support of Hyrcanus, and a civil war resulted in 67 to 63 BC. In that year, Pompey marched an army into Judea and took Jerusalem, and the Jews became subject to the government of Rome. In 63 BC, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Magnus meaning the Great, known in history as Pompey the Great, in 106 to 48 BC, ended the war by capturing Syria from Antiochus XIII, king of Syria, capturing Jerusalem and exiling Aristobulus II, his family and many other Jews to Rome. He re-established Hyrcanus II as high priest, but not as king. Also, Pompey greatly reduced the Jewish territory in Judah, seizing the territory to the Roman provinces. Pompey died in 48 BC, and after his death, Hyrcanus and Antipater supported Gaius Julius Caesar, a Roman political leader and general. Gaius Julius Caesar rewarded them in 47 BC, by making Antipater procurator, the Roman governor of Judea, and Hyrcanus II, to establish an office as high priest with limited political power. He returned Jewish territories seized by Pompey, and he withdrew all Roman soldiers from Judea. In 44 to 43 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar and Antipater were assassinated by rivals, and in 40 BC, Antigonus II, the surviving son of Aristobulus II, captured Hyrcanus with the help of Parthian troops. Antigonus proclaimed himself king of Judea, but the next year in 39 BC, the Roman Senate declared Herod, known as Herod the Great, king of Judea. Herod promptly set out to dethrone Antigonus. With the aid of Roman soldiers, he succeeded in capturing Antigonus and putting him to death in 37 BC. Herod then brought Hyrcanus II back to Jerusalem. Later he was accused of participating in a conspiracy against Herod and was executed in 30 BC. In 66 to 63 BC, Aristobulus II carried on his father's views on religion and politics. While his mother was still alive, he flattered the nobles and military party by establishing himself supporter of the Sadducees, and bringing their case before his mother, the queen. Aristobulus II's plan was to usurp the government. Therefore, many strongholds which the queen placed at the disposal of the Sadducees, supposedly for their defense against the Pharisees, started in reality one of the preparatory moves of Aristobulus to usurp the government. The queen sought to direct his military zeal outside Judea, and sent him in 70 to 69 BC, against Ptolemy Menei, but when the undertaking failed, Aristobulus resumed his political intrigues. He left Jerusalem and took friends who controlled the largest number of fortified palaces, with the intention of making war against his mother, the queen. However, his mother died, and he immediately turned against his brother Hyrcanus. The last Hasmonaean prince was Aristobulus III, 36 BC. Aristobulus III was only a high priest. He was the last of the Hasmonaean Dynasty. He was the brother of Herod the Great's wife, and paternal grandson of Aristobulus II. Herod tried to expel Aristobulus from the priesthood, but his mother Alexandra, through negotiation with Cleopatra and Mark Antony, compelled Herod to remove Hananel from office of high priest and appoint Aristobulus instead. Herod sought to secure himself from Aristobulus by spying on him and his mother. This surveillance proved so deadly that they sought to gain their freedom by taking refuge with Cleopatra. Herod's suspicions grew heavily against his brother-in-law, and to keep from resorting to violence, during a banquet organized by Aristobulus' mother, Herod caused him to be drowned while he was bathing in a pool in Jericho. Aristobulus III died in 36 BC. This was the end of the Hasmonaean dynasty. The Hasmonaean Jewish kingdom, like its forerunners, faced widespread factional conflict. The Jewish state was marked by religious and political turmoil. During a civil conflict between two brothers, Hyrcanus III, and Aristobulus II, an Idumean name, Antipater, supposedly a supporter of Hyrcanus, with intrigue teamed up with the Roman general Pompey the Great. Rome entered Judea, and in 47 BC, the kingdom under the Hasmoneans became formally subject to Roman rule in 63 BC, with Antipater as procurator. Antipater's son Herod the Great became king in 37 BC, until his death in 4 BC. He was the reigning king at the time of Jesus' birth. The Hasmonaean Jewish Religious Sects started around 100 BC and lasted through the New Testament era. The Hasmoneans, under their Jewish state, sought with much effort to keep the Jewish religion pure and free of foreign influence. There were mainly two major prominent political parties formed of the fundamentals and of the priestly aristocratic class in Judaism, that came into being by the middle of the 4th century BC, namely the Pharisees and the Sadducees. During the Hasmonean period, the Pharisees and the Sadducees functioned primarily as political parties. It was during the 1st century AD, that they became the accepted religious leaders of the Jewish people. Each party claimed to be true followers of Judaism, but their beliefs were noticeably different in religious doctrine as they were in political theory. The Hasmoneans established the Sanhedrin, a council of state composed of 71 Jewish leaders and elders, that was the supreme authority for civil and religious legal decisions. The Pharisees were one important group among the Jewish society even during the 1st century AD. They served as priests, many were teachers of the law, and many worked at the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish Supreme Council and Court of Justice in New Testament times. The Sanhedrin consisted of 71 priests, scribes, and elders. They were the Jewish leaders and advisors, and they were the supreme authority for civil and religious legal decisions. They remained separate from the Roman government and enjoyed more support among the Jewish people because they did not go along with the Roman Empire, to whom they were later subject to, nor did they believe in rebelling against the Roman authority either. The Pharisees preached to laymen, and their activities were centered mainly in the synagogues. In doctrine, they held not only to the law of Moses and to the scriptures, but they held to a whole body of oral traditions, the commentaries, called the Oral Torah. However, the way that they observed the law was insincere, for they had not comprehended God's purpose for seeking obedience to the law that was of the heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith, from which they had strayed. They believed in and preached the resurrection, however, they had turned aside to idle talk, desiring to be teachers of the law, neither understanding what they say, nor the things which they affirm. The Pharisees hated Jesus for exposing their hypocrisy. They blindly guided the people through their traditional teachings, that they themselves were so blind and ignorant of the scriptures and the law of God, that they themselves failed to see that Jesus was the Messiah, the scriptures spoke of to come. They searched the scriptures, for in them they thought they had eternal life, and the scriptures were they, which testified of Jesus. However, they were not willing to come to him that they may have life. The second Hasmonaean religious group in Jerusalem, in the Jewish society and during the 1st century AD, was the Sadducees. These leaders were well educated, wealthy, and occupied the highest branches of their Jewish society. The Sadducees were associated with the priestly status, and took on the responsibilities of priestly duties for which worship was centered in the Jerusalem temple. They came from the leading families of the nation, the priests, merchants, and aristocrats. The high and the most powerful members of the priesthood were mainly Sadducees. The Sadducees enjoyed privileged positions in society and managed to get along well under Roman rule. Unlike the Pharisees who separated themselves from the Roman government, the Sadducees sought peace and operated along with the Roman government. However, any movement that they saw might upset order and authority, was destructive to them. The Sadducees were not interested in the plan of God, but were more concerned about their position, status, and authority in society. The Sadducees were priests in charge of teaching the law of God to the people of Israel, for they were the authorities the Jewish people went to for the interpretation or application of the law. They gave enormous significance of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament of the Bible, as their authoritative scripture. Unfortunately, the Sadducees were not respected by the people, because they were corrupt. The Sadducees rejected the tradition of the elders, the oral traditions, the commentaries called the Oral Torah. They had no belief in the resurrection, neither did they have any interest in spiritual things. This automatically placed them in direct conflict with the Pharisees, who had made the tradition surrounding the law almost as important as the law itself. The Sadducees insisted that only the laws that were written in the law of Moses, the Pentateuch, were binding. The chief priests, too, were clueless of God's plan of salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus, the Messiah. The Sadducees played a major role in the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus. In 70 AD, at the destruction of the temple by the Romans, the Sadducees had not a temple to perform their priestly duties anymore, therefore, they faded out of existence. The Essenes were another group of people who lived different from others in the Jewish society. They existed during the Hasmonaean period of the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD. This Jewish group practiced strict asceticism. They were members of a Jewish religious brotherhood, who maintained a monastic way of life, living in communal settlements on the shores of the Dead Sea. History records them as a group that mostly lived in the wilderness or caves, renouncing a normal life within the Jewish community. Holding that the Sadducees and the Pharisees were responsible for polluting the Jewish religion, they chose to live separately and away in isolation in small communities of their own. The Essenes' fundamental teachings were to love God, and one's fellow man. They taught virtue and practiced the distribution of property according to the need of those without. They kept the strict observance of the Sabbath, and they dressed in white garments. One Essene community of the 1st century AD, preserved ancient Hebrew scrolls, that were later discovered in caves in the year 1946, near the site of the Dead Sea, at Khirbet Qumran, about 14 miles from Jerusalem. They were called the Wadi Dead Sea Scrolls, because they were found in a cave close to the Dead Sea. The manuscripts and documents were believed to be those from the sect of the Essenes, and dated between 200 BC and 66 to 70 AD. Among the scrolls found in the caves was a manual of discipline, which outlines the Essene pattern of life, as known from Greek and Latin sources, such as the writings of Philo-Judaeus, a Hellenistic Jewish scholar and philosopher of Alexandria, the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, and the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Sadly, even the Essenes were unaware of the plan of God to sacrifice the Messiah to redeem the world. Thank you for listening. If you have been blessed by this video, please like, subscribe, and share. Thanks.